Good morning, everyone. This is a huge audience. Super excited. I mean, I'm sure people are packing out the house to talk about trust at 9:40 in the morning. It's great. But I'm going to start out, actually, I'm going to make this audience engaged because trust is a hot topic in healthcare right now. And love to get some feedback from the audience, and most of these people are no to, so I'm going to pick on them and ask them to ask questions. So when you think about trust, what's the feeling? What feeling do you come up with? What does the word trust engender in everyone? So I hear feel good. I hear safety. You don't have to worry about it, right? And how do you build that trust? How does trust come about in our relationships? How do you trust people with your information? How do you trust people with your kids? How do you build that trust? What does it come from? Communication. Ms. Burke? Relationships. And there's a lot of discussion around trust in the industry. And for the non-no-to people, how many people are aware of some of the trust discussions happening right now in healthcare? I had a feeling. There's a lot being discussed, and it has everything to do with patient information exchange. And every one of us is a patient in healthcare. And we trust that our providers in which we go see, my provider, I trust that they're going to protect my information as a patient. But I don't think about trust with my provider in that way. I don't think about, are you HIPAA compliant? It's not what I think about when I go see my physician. I think that just because I know and I've established a relationship that they're going to protect me and that they're going to trust the information, they're going to protect my information from the rest of the exchange, from the rest of the people in this world. And the reason that this is a big topic right now, because when HIPAA was defined in 1995, HIPAA was not defined with the type of exchange that we're seeing at scale in the United States. And so what's happening is that patient information exchange is now a discussion around if somebody has access to me and we make your information as a patient available to the rest of the United States or to the providers throughout the United States, how do I know that they're acting in good faith to pull my information? How do I know that they can query my physician's record at any time or my provider's record at any time and pull my information back? And we've based the conversation around trust simply around compliance, and that's the baseline. So today we're going to talk about reframing the discussion around trust to be around relationships, around an established pattern of behavior, something that I can trust, that I know my patient information is going to be protected and it's going to happen. Now I got to run this thing also at the same time. I was just hoping it would predict. So it comes back to the question of do we need a national framework? Is this even something that we need? And what do I mean by a national framework? How many are familiar with TEFCA? How many are familiar with care quality? How many debate the value of those two networks? And it would be okay to say it. Yeah. The purpose of a national framework is to get rid of what historically has been point-to-point information exchange, right? So if I wanted to share, and we're all patients, we all have family members that are patients, we've all experienced the terrible inefficiency of our healthcare system. When I could personally relate to this, when I took my father from a acute care setting to a rehab setting to a home health setting back to his neurologist because he has Parkinson's, the information did not flow every time. It did not flow. I had to go either get the records faxed over, I had to go request the records, and it absolutely impacted his care. And for me, that was a failure of our health information exchange system. That was a failure of national healthcare. And that's why these national frameworks are necessary, because they create the baseline of being able to exchange without having to put in point-to-point connections as we talk about health information exchange. So that's the baseline. If we didn't have them, we're going to continue down this path where by 2032, we're going to be insolvent. Medicare is insolvent in 2032, and 25% of it has to do with the cost of operating healthcare in the United States, let alone the patient safety issues that we all experience every day from information not being exchanged at scale. So it's really not a question of should we get rid of the national frameworks, because that is being debated. There's no way to get around the national framework. So how do we establish trust in the national framework so we can all participate and feel good about our information being exchanged at scale? maybe. So it's always funny because we talk about data always becomes the center of the discussion in healthcare, and it's not about data. There's data everywhere. The quality of the data may be debated, but healthcare, generally speaking, has a trust problem. We don't trust each other because we don't have aligned incentives. We don't have aligned business models, but yet there's more data flowing. So data is not the discussion here. It feels like the discussion, but that's a symptom because your data doesn't flow from one care setting to the next. But the real conversation is how do we establish trust as a healthcare industry, trust each other, technology vendors trust each other, patients trust their providers trust each other. How do we get to that core operating model so we can establish trust between each other? But I'll go to what our original question is how do I know that I trust somebody with my kids? How do I know that I trust a provider? And I always say that trust is a prediction based upon previous behavior. I've established that trust with you. There's something in your character, there's something in your operating model, another business. Like when I choose a bank or I choose to, call a real estate agent, I've established a trust with them. There's something that I've established that builds that relationship with that provider. And we cannot continue to talk about compliance or HIPAA as a way we establish trust. That's baseline. That's expectation. That is an expectation and a requirement that we should all have as patients, that my provider systems, that these networks, which No2 is a network, is compliant, that we're managing to the baseline. It is a pattern. And so how do we establish a pattern of trust as a health information exchange network so that people trust us? And that's the discussion we're going to have here briefly today on how No2 is reframing the discussion around trust, not to be a compliance discussion, but a discussion around how we operate as a network, and that how we engender your trust as patients, how we engender trust from the providers, because they are the heartbeat of healthcare. Debated or not, we always talk about the patients, but the providers are the heartbeat of healthcare. How do we establish trust with them that we're going to do the right thing as a network and make sure that they're taken care of? So I go back to this discussion as every discussion sounds the same. And I know this because we sit in the heart of it. We sit in the heart of it with TEFCA. We're sitting on many of the steering committees with care quality. And it's always around baseline. It's always around HIPAA. It's always around compliance. And it's always around encryption. Again, these are core things that you should assume are in place and that a network has in place. And they're part of what we continue to be a trusted network. So I always say that compliance doesn't create the right behavior. It creates a baseline. It's actually trust that creates the right behavior, and trust with a network that creates the right behavior. So the other question I've asked our vendors, if a network went down at 2 a.m. or it was having issues, and as a provider, you're a cardiac surgeon or you're in the ER, you have a patient show up, would you still trust that network? Or am I losing trust based upon my performance? Am I losing trust because we didn't show up for you when you needed us? Or would you say, oh, they're good because they're HIPAA compliant? No, that is not how you establish trust with a healthcare network. You establish trust with a healthcare network that isn't based just upon compliance, but how we show up when you need us the most. And this is where the industry has continued to get it wrong, and we are working very aggressively as a network to reframe the conversation around not just what's legally permissible, but what's appropriate, what's clinically appropriate. How do we perform? How do we make sure that your patients and your providers' data is protected, and that how we establish consistent trust with our partners and with those partners' providers and their patients that they have on their network. So we'll continue to say, as a network and as healthcare's largest communication infrastructure, that trust is not policy. Trust is consistency. How do we make sure that on our onboarding processes, so when we bring somebody onto our network, we bring a technology partner, whether they're an EHR vendor, an AI platform, an technology innovation, a patient engagement platform, how do we make sure that they're following a trust guideline that protects the patient's information. And that all has to do with the onboarding of our patients. And we're tested at our worst moment. How do we make sure that when we bring somebody on and we've got a bad actor, because that will happen on the networks, that we're taking care of your patient's information and that we're managing in our worst moment, and it has everything to do with who we're serving. And we'd like to serve up the discussion that the networks are about the providers that sit underneath, even though every discussion is around the patient, and that is who the beneficiary is, that the providers, if we're serving the providers, we're making sure that they're being taken care of. So then we'll ask the question is what if we built a network and we reframe the discussion around providers, not around the data, not around the patient, because the patient is the beneficiary, but around the provider. And that we served every decision that we allowed for our network. Does it benefit the provider at the end of the day? Because that's where the buck stops, is with the provider. Making sure that it's not just something that's aspirational, that trust isn't aspirational, but we're making decisions based upon clinical need. And that we know that every decision we make will make sure that that provider is benefited, and that we're not making decisions that will end up harming them and the trust that they've established with their patients. And so we are publishing, for the first time in the industry for any network, what we're calling the Trust Accord. And No2's Trust Accord, as a health information exchange network, is made up of 6 different domains. And underneath that is 107 operating principles that will allow us to become the network of choice because we are trusted for the information and the ethics that we bring to the discussion. And the experience that we bring, first of all, to our providers, which ultimately our patients and our payers win because our providers are protected. And everything that they're expected to be able to maintain and trust for their patients is protected as part of the network. Under those 6 domains, like I said, we have 107 different operating principles. And those operating principles we're going to be establishing at a national level, again, to make sure that as technology vendors, as those that are serving the providers, and ultimately the patients win based upon the network experience that you have, because the industry has never had to manage to a health information exchange at scale. And we want to reframe the discussion from a compliance discussion, baseline requirements for HIPAA and for encryption, to how do we build a trust accord? How many are familiar with Claude? They use Anthropic. Have you looked at Claude's constitution? Anybody familiar with Claude's constitution? Go to Anthropic's website. So as AI, I mean, there's no technology vendors that are faced with more critical decisions than our AI vendors, right? As it relates to ethics, operating principles, what they're doing, because they have so much influence. You go out to Claude's website, they have a constitution that they publish that they're constantly updating. That is the constitution of how their learning models are learning and making sure that they stay within the safeguard rails, these rails that they've built. And they're actually using, for instance, the United Nations policies for human rights. That's part of their learning model. But that constitution, I thought it was a great example to say that these are how health information exchange networks. We need to start not talking about HIPAA anymore. That's a given. That's a requirement, right? This is a discussion on how we ensure that as people come to our network, that we're protecting you as consumers first, protecting our providers, and reframe the discussion. That's what the Trust Accord is built on for No2, is a set of operating principles that have never been discussed, because this has never been done in healthcare. Information exchange at scale has never been done in healthcare. Being able to pull a patient's record without having to call and ask for it to be faxed over has never been done. And so we're in a whole new world, and we need to operate at a different level of integrity that's not been operated before. So we're really excited to bring this forward focus, and you'll notice the last line, and again, it's a change of subject, it's a reframing of the discussion. Providers are our focus first, because everyone wins from that. The patient wins, the rest of the world wins if providers know that they're protected in healthcare. And this is where I come back to, is like, how many as patients feel you should have access to your information at any time? I would say that. I think that is a right that you have. As a provider, how do I make sure that when I make it available to you, to the patient, that information is protected? And it's not because we build a network for patients, It's because we build a network for providers that serve the patients and make sure your information is at scale. Because if providers don't participate, your information doesn't matter. It's not going to be made available. We have to build the trust that providers make that information available so patients have access to that information and patients can access their own records. But let's not try to solve our care coordination problem and our treatment problem and patients getting access to information through the patient. Let's solve the real problem and have providers online at scale across the continuum and really see how that shapes the conversation differently for then patients to start navigating their own care. And that's where we want to reframe the discussion, because as it says at the bottom, the provider is the last mile of every care interaction. That's how it sits in healthcare today. As much as we want to talk about the provider and the AI and providers going away and patients doing their own thing, absolutely true. But providers will be the last mile of interaction, and we need to protect their information at scale. And that's where we do believe, as a network, that you do need, similar to, I used this example yesterday. Does anybody know, this is a trick question, because if somebody knows it, I'm going to ask you to come on stage and take over the part. But when the FAA came around, nope, doesn't count. When the FAA was established, 1958. The FAA, do you know why it was established? Does anybody know why? Nope. Why the FAA was established. The FAA came out of airlines. So United and American, airlines were already operating. They had their own policies. They were operating within their own network. And then there was multiple crashes, but the big one that happened was in Arizona. United Airlines and American, 2 flights crashed, and you had 128 people die in that crash. And then all of a sudden, the national attention was there. Say, this isn't working. I can't trust you as United and you as American that you're going to work together in the gray matter, in the gray space, I always say, in the airspace that was surrounding it. That was the part of the world that was not managed. So you, as an airline, you covered your rules. You built the trust with I was going to say patients, but they're not patients, or customers that come on your plane. But as soon as you took off and you had that airspace surrounding it, you had to have a baseline of operating governance that you couldn't define, or you couldn't define because it would be in your favor. Somebody had to define that. And that's where the FAA was born out of. And that's why we have things like TEFCA, which is a national exchange framework to manage the baseline, manage requirements, so that as people break the rules, and that's going to happen, that we have enforcement of those rules. We have somebody governing it, and people are operating with this baseline policy. And that's why these standards are necessary. Again, that's baseline, that's compliance. That's not meeting the expectation for trust, because then it comes back to the airlines. Is that the airline still establishes trust. When you get on a plane, I trust that that pilot has gone through the necessary training, has done the right things, knows what to do in an emergency. But I also trust that the FAA has set standards that when that plane takes off, and we've had some issues here recently, right? That's a challenge. But when that plane takes off, is that airspace is being managed and it's being governed. And that's why we do need these national networks to manage to accountability. But that is the baseline. That's the starting point at every network pass that is responsible. So that's where we come back to. Trust is the standard. The network set the trust standard. TEFCA sets the baseline. And our conversations continue from there. So opening it up for any questions, but thank you for your time today. That was it. Any questions? Thank you.